So, chapter 11, flour, lumber, and iron. I don't want to hear that being bounced. Flour, lumber, and iron are the ones that we are going to be focusing on from the late 1800s. The time of those settlers. So last chapter we were learning about all of those settlers coming in, the railroad coming in, and we're going to see how all of that played a part in these industries becoming very big in Minnesota. Keywords, we have industrialization. That was the industries getting big. And the industrialist is the person who is big in the industry. IST tells us it's a person. We're going to learn about investing, bushels, and iron ore. So those are keywords we are learning about. So let's listen to our intro about
the trains that chugged across the landscape during the late 1800s signaled the arrival of a new era in Minnesota, an era of industrialization. During this period, large factories and big machines were replacing many of the small businesses that created handmade products. Companies that had been owned by one person or by several partners grew into corporations, companies with many owners called stockholders. By forming a corporation and selling stock, businesses could bring together the money of many people. This allowed them to hire more workers, buy expensive machinery, and expand their operations. Entire industries or branches of business developed that specialized in certain products or services. The railroad industry was an important example of this process, but there were many others.
So last chapter we learned about the railroads coming in. We learned about James J. Hill, right? People that were building these big industries. So these industries grew out of the small little town factories. So they had a sawmill at the small town. We're going to see how it grows into a big industry and becomes like a booming industry. It just grows huge. So that's what this chapter is about, how things just kind of blew up. It got huge here in Minnesota.
In Minnesota's first 50 years of statehood, 3 industries became particularly important to its economy: flour milling, lumber, and iron mining. Each of these industries succeeded by finding the right mix of at least 3 key ingredients: natural resources that could be used to make products, machines that made it easier to use those natural resources, people who were willing to invest money, ideas, and physical labor to make use of both natural resources and machines to make products.
What is a natural resource? Eleanor? Something that you can find out in nature, right? You can go somewhere where no human has been, and you can find natural resources. It's those things that are naturally there. They're not man-made. So we're going to be thinking about natural resources for each of these industries, what they use, not the machines. That's a different section. Natural resources is what is just out in nature. When we start our sections, we will see that there's a circle graph. Each part is labeled natural resources, people and jobs, and machines. Number 1 says, in each section of the circle, write a few examples of things or people that help Minnesota's flour milling industry grow. So a few. It doesn't say a, that would be 1. It doesn't say a couple, that would be 2. It says a few. So you need to write at least 3 examples. Can you write more? Oh, yes, you can write more. The more you put on your comprehension page, the more it's going to help you when it comes time to study for the test. So you can put all the things in there. It does not have to be in complete sentences. This is a comprehension page. Comprehension page, you can put bullets. You can number them. Okay, you can just list it. When it comes time for the test, we know that's when it has to be complete sentences.
Minnesota's flour milling, lumber, and iron mining industries took advantage of these and other factors to grow bigger and more profitable during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Their owners became rich, and their workers earned a living.
So, our first section, Charles Pillsbury and the flour milling industry. How many of us have heard of Pillsbury? I would think everybody's hand would be up. You walk down the baking aisle in the grocery store and you see Pillsbury cake mixes. You see Pillsbury flour bag. You see the picture of the Pillsbury Doughboys. They have him on commercials and you poke his stomach and he giggles. That's all Pillsbury. That's from here in Minnesota. So now that I've expanded it, I didn't say Charles Pillsbury, I said who has heard of Pillsbury? How many of us have heard of Pillsbury?
Michael. I don't go with the baking section. I haven't heard of Doughboy. I probably heard. My favorite's like the same.
Have you seen the Pillsbury Doughboy?
No.
How many of you have heard of the Pillsbury or seen the Pillsbury Doughboy?
I've seen the. He giggles whenever
Yeah, the ad.
He giggles.
Yeah. Oh, Michael.
All
right. So the company Pillsbury comes from Charles Pillsbury. Okay, he's the one that created the company. He named it after himself. Very original. Right? So he named it after himself and it is everywhere now. So we're going to find out how it started.
Charles Pillsbury and the flour milling industry. Minneapolis was a town of small businesses when 27-year-old Charles Pillsbury arrived in 1869. Pillsbury had grown up in New Hampshire. There, he had learned the ins and outs of the business world while working for a company that distributed farm produce to nearby markets in Montreal, Canada. When Pillsbury came to Minneapolis, he was thinking big, not small. He planned to start his own business, and he wanted that business to be large. The industry he chose was flour milling.
So he's coming here, he's 27, and he's like, this is America, I want to make it big. I want to have a big industry. I don't want to just have the small little shop and just make enough to get by. I want to be rich. I want to be big. Let's see what he does to get big.
Flour mills had been grinding wheat into flour at the Falls of St. Anthony for 15 years by the time Pillsbury arrived. The amount of flour produced, however, was small compared to major milling centers such as St. Louis, Missouri. Pillsbury and a few other industrialists, people who owned or managed manufacturing businesses, set out to change that. A few months after arriving in Minneapolis, Pillsbury took a gamble. He invested in a failing flour mill, hoping he could turn it around. Pillsbury later recalled, "The other fellows in the business rather pitied me and said that another poor devil had got caught in the milling business."
So he comes in and he has these big lofty goals. He wants to make it rich in this industry. So he starts out small and he buys a failing flour mill. So a flour mill that's not doing well, it's not performing. But he gets his friends together, the other industrialists, and they say, here's our plan. Here's what we can do to make it big. Because we know it can be big. In St. Louis, it's a big flour milling city. We know we can do it. We just have to get there. The other flour millers are saying, they're just going to get eaten up and spit right back out. They're going to fail too, right? It's another poor devil putting his money into it and they're not going to go anywhere. Well, considering how many of us raised our hands and I said, have you heard of Pillsbury? And everybody's like, oh yeah, Pillsbury Doughboy, or oh, I've had cookies or pancakes made from it. Does he make it big? Yeah, he makes it big. So these people that were pitying him, saying, oh, he's going to go under. No, he wasn't. He knew what he was doing.
Pillsbury knew he was getting into a tough business and that he would have to work hard in order to succeed. Within 5 years, his business was flourishing. With his new wealth, he could afford to invest in improvements to his mill and buy additional ones. By the late 1870s, production at his mills had increased from 300 barrels of flour a day to 3,000 barrels a day. Other mill owners also expanded their operations in Minneapolis and saw similar increases in production.
Think about how big of an increase that is. 300 bushels in one day to 3,000. That's a huge increase. So he took this failing flour mill that was really small and not doing well, and he grew and grew and grew that business. to make lots more money, right? The bigger the business, the more money he's gonna make. So how did he do that?
Flour industry essentials. Pillsbury and other flour mill owners relied on money plus a combination of natural resources, new machines, and the labor of people in order to be successful. In the decades after the Civil War, these essentials came together to make Minnesota the flour milling capital of the world.
So off the top of our head, no looking at your book, off the top of your head, think about Minnesota in the 1880s. What would be some big natural resources that we would need for the flour industry? Robbie? Land. We know that soil was rich with all of those nutrients. So that land, the soil is a big natural resource. What's another one, Harper? Wheat, right? King wheat. Everybody started growing wheat. Wheat is used in the flour industry. So the more wheat that's grown, the more flour they can produce. It's huge. What would be another one? Think about where that wheat turns into flour. What would be a big natural resource that's needed?
Iron to make machines.
No, not really. Because we can make machines, that's not considered one of the natural resources we needed for the flour industry. Christine? The prairie grasses, that's the wheat, right? So we already have the wheat. Natalie?
Fuel for machines.
That's not a natural resource. We have to refine it.
Water.
Why water, Alex?
Because plants need water to grow.
Well, the plants need the water, but if we're looking at the factory, why would water be important? I don't know.
Because the water fuels the mill to spin and start burning.
So I don't think we'd use the word fuel, but the water powers. So the movement of the water is the power that they're using. Because remember, what did they not have back in the 1800s? Electricity. So now we just plug machines in it. Back in the 1800s, they used that, they got their power not from the plug, they got their power from the moving water. So water was a huge natural resource to power the machines that they needed. Let's learn about those natural resources.
Natural resources. The land of southern and western Minnesota was excellent for farming. Once covered in prairie grasses, this land was converted to farmland by settlers after the United States acquired it through treaties made with the Dakota and Ojibwe. The rich, deep soil beneath the prairie was ideal for growing wheat, the preferred grain of flour millers. As more land was farmed, the supply of wheat increased dramatically, from 1,400 bushels in 1850 to nearly 19 million bushels in 1870 to more than 52 million bushels in 1890. By the end of the 1800s, Minnesota was the leading wheat-producing state in the nation.
Think about that, king wheat. It takes over. Look at how much more wheat we produced as we got more settlers, more farmers. We got the railroads coming in to help make everything grow and grow and grow. It went from 1,400 bushels in 1850, and it ends in 1890. 40 years later, we're up to 52 million bushels. So 1,400 to 52 million. That wheat, that king wheat, overtook everything, and it made that flour industry huge because we had so much wheat to put into it.
Wheat was valuable because it could be made into flour. In the 1850s and 1860s, it was mostly milled or ground into flour near where it was grown. Local flour mills were built along the rivers and streams of southern and western Minnesota. The moving water supplied the power needed to turn grindstones that ground the wheat. These small mills supplied flour to the surrounding towns and farms.
Anybody ever seen this bridge?
Mm-hmm.
Who said, who's seen it? Robbie, where have you seen that? In Minneapolis. It's called the Stone Arch Bridge. This is from back in the 1880s day. Yeah, some of us, that name kind of triggered it. This is still here today. It's actually where Rosa got her senior pictures done. Lots of people, it's very scenic, it's really pretty. Lots of people go there for their senior pictures because that bridge is still here. What do we notice behind the bridge? What do you notice in that picture, Natalie?
A dam.
What is coming over that dam? Yeah, that's the St. Anthony waterfalls, right? St. Anthony Falls. So if we're thinking about those factories that need the movement of water to power their machines, and you're living in the small towns, you have just the nice flowing streams. You can power some small machines. What are we going to be able to power when we have a waterfall? The big machines. So you could have a flour mill with the small river, right? That small stream. It's still going to power it, but you can't have big machines in that mill. It's going to be a small mill. But we come here and we have the waterfalls. That's fast moving water, lots of power. You can have bigger machines. So the St. Anthony Falls are by the Stone Arch Bridge. There's something else. Nowadays, my kids went on field trips for it when they were in 3rd grade. Over here, there's a building called the Mill City Museum. Has anybody ever heard of Mill City Museum?
Yeah.
You've been there? And what does it tell you about? What do you learn about?
Like how they process things.
Because that used to be the mill back in the day, back in the 1880s. So now we can go to Oliver Kelly Farm, going up to Elk River, and see what the farm was like back in the 1880s. We can go and see James J. Hill's mansion in St. Paul and see how he lived in the 1880s. You can go to the Mill City Museum and see what the mill was like back in the 1880s. So it was actually a working mill right off of the St. Anthony Falls there. Well, let's learn about this bridge.
Welcome to MN90, Minnesota history in 90 seconds.
There are lots of bridges in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but few are as iconic as the James J. Hill Stone Arch Bridge near St. Anthony Falls. Today, it's a walking and biking bridge, but according to David Stevens of Mill City Museum, it was built to carry a much heavier load.
The Stone Arch Bridge was for passenger trains pulled by steam locomotives. It's hard to imagine the trains fitting on there. For one thing, it seems relatively narrow, and between the time when the bridge was built and several decades later, the train cars got bigger, and they actually had to modify the bridge, chiseling away some of the parapet walls on the sides.
The Stone Arch was a working railroad bridge until 1981. What's really remarkable, though, is how it was built.
Using really old techniques that the Romans would have used. Most of the stones that were used to build the Stone Arch Bridge were placed by human and horsepower.
So why such an elaborate process when there were simpler ways to build a bridge?
James J. Hill really wanted not just a practical bridge, but he also wanted a sort of a signature bridge that would sort of symbolize him and his railroad, and it really achieved that goal.
MN90 is a co.
So, this bridge was made by who? James J. Hill. He was the big, powerful empire builder. And he wanted a bridge that would be kind of iconic, his signature bridge. When I see this bridge, I know, because I've lived in Minnesota all my life, I know, oh, that's the Stone Arch Bridge. I didn't necessarily know it was called the James J. Hill Stone Arch Bridge. But now you all know, and you'll connect it with his name. Oh, James J. Hill Mansion in St. Paul, the James J. Hill Stone Arch Bridge. It's still around. He built it to last. He built it so people would remember it. People like my daughter go there for pictures, right? It's a big thing here in Minnesota.
By the 1870s, however, the area around the Falls of St. Anthony became the center of flour milling in Minnesota. The wide waterfall on the Mississippi River provided enough water power to operate huge mills, much larger than the local mills farmers had previously relied on. As the fast-moving water flowed over the falls, it turned turbines and water wheels. These turbines then spun the shafts that powered the grindstones inside the mills. Producing flour required natural resources abundant in Minnesota. land for growing wheat, and water power to operate the mills.
3 big natural resources for you. Now we're talking about those machines. Instead of just being the small mills in the small towns in western Minnesota, they're growing bigger and bigger and bigger to be a big industry, to make lots of flour. So let's learn about these new machines that they were using.
Machines. Until the 1870s, flour made from Minnesota wheat was speckled with brown flecks of bran and germ. These flecks made bread less appealing, slower to rise, and faster to decay than bread made with pure white flour. In Pillsbury's words, it was way down at the bottom of the heap. That was before the Minneapolis millers started using machines that greatly improved the quality of their flour. A new machine called the Middlings Purifier removed the brown flecks, which turned Minnesota wheat into the white flour that consumers preferred. In addition, the old millstones were being replaced by steel rollers. These ground the flour finer and faster, improving quality and increasing production. By the early 1880s, Minnesota flour was considered some of the best in the world.
Nowadays, people are going back and saying, we want the 9-grain bread, the 12-grain bread. We want all of those grains in our bread. We don't want the white bread because we want the healthier stuff. We want all of those grains. Well, back then, that's all that they knew was the bread made out of the grains, and we want it to be, think about my kids don't like the 12-grain bread. They want the fluffy white bread because it tastes better, right? Mr. Gambito's like, no, we need to have the 12 grains because we need to be healthy. The 12-grain bread doesn't last as long. It doesn't have all the preservatives in it for it to stay longer. The white bread that people were wanting could last longer. They didn't have to eat it all up right away. It was fluffy. It tastes better. So they figured out the machine to help them get all of those brown flecks and the grains out of the flour so they could have that pure white flour. And people would want it more because they've never had it. It was new. So that, the Middling Purifier was a new important machine that they started using because it took all of that grain out, all of those flecks out to make it pure flour.
Machines were also needed to transport the wheat and the flour. The expansion of railroads in Minnesota beginning in the 1870s was key to this industry's success. Railroads allowed farmers to ship their wheat to mills in Minneapolis and allowed mill owners to ship their flour to the rest of the country.
Oh, I missed it before. They had new steel rollers, so they replaced the old millstones with those new steel rollers to make those machines go so much better. So they had the Middling Purifiers, they had the steel rollers. Think about all those railroads and how they were expanding. The farmers at first, remember, were excited for railroads to come in because they could put all of their crops on it and send it farther away. So they're growing more and more wheat. So now we have more places to send that wheat, people who could use all of that wheat. So the railroads were big machines that were important that came in during this time. So back in 1830, the wheat and flour industry was really small because they couldn't do anything with all the wheat that was grown. Now, they're growing more wheat and they have a way to send it to people who have the big factories who could use it. We're going to skip this section and come back to it. Well, let's look at the people. We talked about natural resources, we talked about machines. Who do you think would be the most important person to put into the people section? Amala? Parker? Charles Pillsbury. Okay, for each of these industries, we're going to learn about the important industrialists that grew that industry. So you need to know that Charles Pillsbury is connected with the flour industry. Now, Amala's not wrong. Farmers are very important to the flour industry, but most important for each of these 3 industries for our test purposes, we need to know which industrialist is connected with which industry. So one of the people you're going to want to put in your section is Charles Pillsbury. And like Amala was saying, farmers were important. And there were other people that were important. So let's list all the people that were important in the flour industry.
People.
Especially
The flour milling industry relied on the labor of many different types of workers. Farmers, railroad workers, machinists, barrel makers, and mill workers all played essential roles in the production of flour. Charles Pillsbury and the other Minneapolis flour mill owners employed thousands of men and women to turn wheat into flour. The jobs they performed ranged from unskilled to highly skilled.
So lots of different types of people that they listed here. List them on your paper.
The highest paid workers tended the huge machines at the mills. Their jobs required the most skill and were also the most dangerous. Many lost an arm or a hand in the big machines. The packers who caught the flour in barrels and bags as it poured off the assembly lines were among the lowest paid workers in the mills. So were the workers who nailed the flour barrels shut and who swept the floor. The unskilled jobs were not only low wage, but also boring and repetitive. These jobs offered little chance of moving up to better paying jobs. If workers wanted to earn more, they would have to improve their human capital by learning new skills.
So when I was your age, driving in a car, I'd have to wear my seatbelt. When I got into high school, they made it a law that in the front seat you had to wear a seatbelt if you were sitting in the front seat. Then later it came if you're sitting in the back seat, you have to wear a seatbelt. When cars first came out, they didn't even have seatbelts. Why is it a law now that we have to wear seatbelts, Robbie? Safer. How do we know it's safer? Alyssa? There were all these accidents and people got injured and they weren't wearing seatbelts. And they said, well, we need to make it safer. Same thing with these machines. Cars are a machine. That middling purifier, new machine, they don't know all of the problems that can happen until accidents happen and we learn from it. So when they're first being used, those middling purifiers, big, huge machine, and let's say a clump of wheat gets stuck in there and it stops the machine. Well, the supervisor is going to say, come on, fix it. We got to get moving. We want to make those 52 million bushels, right? We need to produce more. Come on, fix it, fix it, fix it. So the worker's going to say, well, I can see the clump. I'm just going to reach in and move the clump up. Well, what happens when the clump gets removed? What happens with the machine? Yeah, it starts working again. Right? You reach your hand in to take the clump out, you don't move fast enough. That machine starts working. The clump's moved and it's going to start moving. It's going to start working. People really did lose their hands and their arms because they didn't realize how unsafe it was. Nowadays, we can push the button to turn the machine off, unplug it. There's safety guards, so you can't just reach your hand in. You have certain tools that you reach in to move out the clumps, right? We've learned from the accidents of the past, but when there's new machines, these people were just learning about it. So the people that get paid the most are the ones in the most dangerous positions. Oh goodness, 3 people before you lost their hand. I don't know if I want to do that job. I'm going to pay you double. Oh, that's a lot of money. I think I'm going to take my chances, right? So they paid them more because they didn't have money. They would take the chances with the dangerous jobs. They would learn how not to get their hand cut off. What can I do to prevent that from happening, right? So they're learning from other people's mistakes. So the more dangerous jobs and the jobs that you need more training for. Well, if you're going to put me in this job using this machine, I want to know how to use it correctly, right? I need to know not to just reach my hand in, but what I can use to fix it without getting hurt. So because it's dangerous, because they're doing more training, they get paid more. When I was in college, I worked at a factory and I was unskilled, right? They taught me how to do spot welding. I would take the little bracket, put it on the machine, press the button, and it would go boom, and it would weld down the little bracket onto the pot. And I would do the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And I just did that for 8 hours. And it was not exciting. Paid money. It wasn't the best money, but it paid me money. right? That's what I needed when I was in college. Not any skill to it, so I didn't get paid a lot. Other people I worked with were working on the big machines. They were doing all the big jobs, they got paid more because they had more training, they had a better human capital.
By 1880, Charles Pillsbury, his fellow mill owners, and their workers had turned Minneapolis into the nation's leading flour producer. As production and profit increased, large milling companies began buying up small milling companies. By 1890, 4 corporations, or very large companies, accounted for 87% of the city's flour production. Of those 4 corporations, C.A. Pillsbury and Company was the largest.
So when Pillsbury first came in, people were pitying him. Oh, he's buying that failing flour mill. He's going to lose all his money just like the other people. But instead, he learned from other people's mistakes. He learned from the successes in like St. Louis and other big cities that had big mills. And he was able to grow and expand to be this huge company that's still around today, making products that we use, that we enjoy. We're going to come back to this Bonanza Farms. So there's not a question on the comprehension page about Bonanza Farms, but it is important for us to know, because we will see it again. Hint, hint, you might want to put notes on your comprehension page so you remember it is important to know about Bonanza Farms.
We just have to put the jobs for the few, or do we need to have jobs in for like the...
Well, you need to have Charles Pillsbury.
Yeah.
And farmers, farming,
Yeah.
say, that's people and job. And they go together. All right, Bonanza Farms. Let's see.
We need a first yeah.
Bonanza Farms. Over time, people find new ways to use the same land. During the 1870s and 1880s in Minnesota, and also North Dakota, a certain kind of farm, called a bonanza farm, became a phenomenon and then died out. A bonanza farm was an extremely large farm that grew only one crop, usually wheat. Most of these farms ranged from 3,000 to 7,000 acres. Some were as large as 45,000 acres.
So remember with that Homestead Act, how many acres did a farmer get? Harper? 160, 180, 160, 180, somewhere around there. Now these bonanza farms are 3,000 to 7,000 acres, some up to 45,000 acres for one farm. Yeah, that's huge, right? So we have king wheat, everybody's growing the wheat, and now we're gonna make these massive, huge farms because people like Pillsbury are growing the flour industry. There's a place, railroads, that we can transport it in. So the bonanza farms became huge. But then something happens to make them go away.
A variety of factors led to the sudden, brief success of these farms. Availability of farmland, large numbers of settlers wanting to farm, expansion of the railroads, and improved milling technology. Then, after a period of prosperity, bonanza farms exhausted the land. The wheat had drawn so many nutrients from the soil that it could no longer produce a healthy crop. This made it harder for farms that grew only wheat to make a profit, so bonanza farms died out. If you don't already know, find out what the word bonanza means. Why would this type of farm have the name bonanza?
Okay, so I'm going to leave it up to you to look up what the word bonanza means. But think about why they stopped being in existence. We don't have bonanza farms now. We don't go to western Minnesota and see 45,000 acres for one farm, all growing wheat. Because that wheat all takes the same nutrients out of the ground. And when you grow the same thing over and over and over again, it's taking nutrients out, but it's not replenishing them. That's why people were doing diversified farming. On our test, a lot of us said, oh, diversified farming is when you grow enough to sell at the market. But we forgot that diversify means diverse different types of crops. So people would grow different types of crops, so it's not all the same thing, so they can replenish nutrients in the ground, give the ground a break from just growing all of that wheat. Right, so we don't have bonanza farms anymore because they used up all of those good nutrients out of the land. They had to plant other things to get nutrients back in the land. James?
What I think is probably, like, other farmers needed land too, and that's why they stopped. That's what I think.
That did not come up
Yeah,
in here,
no, but-
so it's a good thought, but it's not something you'd want to put on the test because it's not something that we know is fact,
Yeah.
okay? So, bonanza farms are those farms that were huge in Minnesota. Those bonanza farms were growing what main crop? Everybody? Wheat. That king wheat, it was huge, right? So no more bonanza farms. They grew, they expanded, everybody made all this money, and then the land stopped producing it. So we have made it through, so Nolan, you need to know this, we made it through all of the flour industry. So you should have answered that number 2 question also. Explain how farming helped fuel the growth of the flour milling industry in Minnesota. So all of those farms were growing, all of King Wheat was coming in. How did that help? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm still talking. All of those farms were coming up in western Minnesota. King Wheat's coming in. How did that help the flour milling industry in Minneapolis grow? How did Minnesota become one of the flour capitals of the world? So with that, if you're listening to this at home, I hope you are well and hope to see you soon. Have a wonderful day.